That's better, okay. I know it's the last day. Everybody's got their bags packed. You're ready to go home unless you have one of those 30-hour flights. I'm very glad to be able to be here this morning and talk to you about Lockerbie. I'm going to do a 20-year investigation in less than an hour. So we're going to go through this real fast. But what I did, I actually wrote a book about the Lockerbie case. I thought it was after everything was done, the trial, the appeal, but there's currently another appeal going on, but it had nothing to do with when I wrote my book back in, it was published in 2006. And I'm going to give away 2 copies of it. And one of them is kind of cheating because I was trying to figure out how to do it. And I'm going to do it. I had a birthday yesterday, so I'm going to say that anyone, and I already know there is someone who has a birthday today, is going to get a copy of my book, and I'll sign it after I'm finished. Is she in here? I bumped into her out in the hallway. Maybe she didn't come back. Anybody have a birthday today? Anybody have one yesterday? Okay, forget about it. Anybody have one tomorrow? Who has a birthday close to today? August, what? 3rd. August 3rd. Anybody closer than August 3rd? What's yours? 9th? Anybody between the 3rd and the 9th? Going once, going twice? Okay, come and see me after we're done and we'll talk about that. As I immediately screw this up. Okay, life is good. I'm going to talk about the significance of forensics because that's why you're here. That literally drove this case. A lot of people think it was intelligence and we made stuff up. I'm going to talk about attention to detail because you're going to see some very minute pieces of evidence that were collected at the crime scene by police officers in Scotland. I'm going to talk about cooperation between agencies because even though I'm going to go through this very quickly and you will think, well, you know what, they always got along and shared information, it didn't happen. Significant problems. We had problems with the forensics people in the UK because they had one person looking at all the evidence. And when we offered to help, they said, no, we want to do it ourselves. Some big mistakes were made. I'm going to talk about the importance of pre-planning because when something like this happens, you can't be sitting here saying, now what do we do? You have to think about doing it. And because Catherine's not here, and I also think it's important, I'm going to talk about working with victims. Back in the mid-1980s, the U.S. was being attacked by terrorists all the time, although you didn't read about it very much. It wasn't 9/11. It wasn't the first World Trade Center attack. It was happening overseas. And the U.S. government passed 2 statutes which gave the U.S. government the right to collect evidence and bring people to trial. The first one of those statutes that was passed said that if you kidnap an American during the commission of a terrorist attack, the U.S. government reserves the right to collect evidence, and if we get our hands on you, we'll bring you back to stand trial. The second statute that was passed 2 years later in 1986 said that if you kill or injure an American during the commission of a terrorist attack, the same thing applies. Now, it does not mean that the U.S. government, the FBI, shows up in a foreign country and says, here we are, we're collecting the evidence. That country has the right of first refusal. If they say we don't want to do the investigation, we don't have the capacity to do the investigation, we will say, okay, will you allow us to do it? And normally that would happen. But most countries want to. The UK certainly had a dog in that fight because they lost 11 of their citizens on the ground, as well as losing some people from the UK that were killed actually when the plane crashed. So we're going to have to work with them. And you can see the 1980s. There were some significant numbers of attacks against aviation. 4 of those 26 attacks that took place in the 1980s killed almost 900 people. There was an Air India attack that took place in 1985 that killed 329. Second one was an attack on a Korean airliner that took place, done by the current president of North Korea today, Kim Jong-il. He actually bombed a Korean airliner out of the sky that killed 115. PanAm 103 was the third that killed 270. And then there was a French flight, UTA 772, that crashed over the African desert in 1989 that killed 171 people. So aviation attacks were a significant thing. We know about all the threats that happen in the world today. The world's a very dangerous place. But back in the 1980s, there was a lot of things happening. Number one, there was a war going on between Iran and Iraq. People were dying all the time. Hundreds of thousands of people were dying in that war. And if you remember, one of the things that occurred during that war was there were tankers being sunk by both the Iranians and the Iraqis. The Kuwait government asked the United States to come and put American flags on the tankers, telling both Iran and Iraq, if you attack on a tanker, it's an attack on the United States. And we sent a huge buildup into the Arabian Gulf to try to deter them from sinking these ships bringing oil to the West. But there were a lot of other problems. In 1986, Muammar Gaddafi had his tent bombed, and you're going to hear about that. We believe was the motivation for the Lockerbie attack. But in 1986, his tent was attacked by the U.S. government in retaliation for the bombing of a discotheque in Germany that killed several U.S. servicemen. In 1986, the leader of a Palestinian group that you're going to hear more about in a minute actually said that there'd be no safety for anyone traveling on an American or an Israeli airliner until the Palestinian-Israeli problem was settled. Anybody wants to think that threat's gone away? I don't think so. That problem will probably never be settled in our entire lifetimes. But in 1988, the U.S. government is in full force in the Gulf region, in the Middle East. And on July the 3rd, an Iran Airbus took off from an airport in Iran, taking pilgrims to Mecca. And as the plane gets altitude, someone on the USS Vincennes notices this airplane, and they misread it and believe it's attacking their position. The commander of the USS Vincennes orders the plane shot down, and instead of shooting down a military airplane coming to attack them, he shoots down this Airbus with 290 pilgrims on board the airplane. Certainly the government of Iran was very upset and had a reason to retaliate against the United States. A couple months later in Germany, in October 1988, 16 Palestinian terrorists, members of the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine General Command, PFLP-GC, and I'll refer to them several more times. The PFLP-GC were arrested in Germany in the possession of bombs designed to be used against aviation. This cell was taken down, the cell members were arrested, and the world community was notified about these bombs. A couple months later, in early December, there was a warning called into the U.S. Embassy in Helsinki, which said that in 2 weeks' time, a Finnish woman is going to carry a bomb on board a flight from Frankfurt to the United States. Very specific information. Again, all these things, nobody was connecting the dots back then, but these were some of the threats that were facing the United States in 1988. On the 21st of December, PanAm 103 actually started in Frankfurt as a Boeing 727. About 150 passengers and crew flew from Frankfurt to London, where they then got off that aircraft and got on to the continuation of that flight, which would take them on to New York City and eventually to Detroit. This is the Boeing 747, the Maid of the Seas, scheduled to leave at 6 p.m. 259 passengers and crew were on board that airplane. As the aircraft takes off, it actually departed at 6:25, and as the aircraft gets altitude, air traffic control tells them that the wind is very heavy that night, and they're to take a more northerly routing, which kept them over land a little bit longer. This is where we're going to start to get lucky. The airplane, instead of going out over the Irish Sea across Ireland to the United States, would stay over land for about an extra 30 minutes. And the airplane started north to go south of Greenland, south of Iceland, and then on into the United States. Plane takes off at 7:25, and at 7:03 it disappears from radar, 38 minutes after it takes off. Nobody knew exactly what happened at first. The aircraft starts to drop its cargo. The airplane breaks up as it falls on the small village of Lockerbie, about 400 miles north of London. These pictures were taken in December, so you're going to see it wasn't like they were fighting snow. They weren't fighting ice and sleet. It's a pretty day. The ground is relatively soft, which you'll see in a picture in just a second. But it's also very rural. It's a town of 3,500 people, policed by the smallest police force in the United Kingdom, the Dumfries and Galloway Constabulary. This is what they faced at 7 o'clock in the evening on December the 21st. If you look at that photograph in the upper right-hand part of the screen, you can see how the aircraft broke apart. If you start at the upper left, the explosion inside the cargo container blew a dinner plate-size hole in the side of the plane. The wind, for lack of a better word, from that explosion, the gases went across the cargo container, hit the other good wall, came back across, and ripped the nose cone off the airplane. This literally took less than a second because there were no warnings in any of the black boxes which were recovered. And the airplane started to break up. The nose cone came off, knocked off the number 3 engine, which then knocked off a tail, and from 31,000 feet, the airplane and its cargo started to fall over southern Scotland. If you can see those yellow and blue trails, the Scots taught me a lot of words. One of them was debris. This is where the debris went. The wind is blowing from the west to the east, and the debris trails would eventually end up having evidence to be collected in a crime scene of over 1,400 square kilometers, 845 square miles. Think about what you do when you go to a crime scene. I would dare say most of them are a little bit smaller than that. This is what the police were faced with on the very first night. The chief constable set us several goals. Number one, he said, I don't know what caused this. If I had a week to talk to you, we could talk about what leaders do in times of crisis. When you think about this police force, their biggest crime problem in 1988 had been bicycle theft. And all of a sudden, you have a chief constable that says, I need to do something to find out about this airplane that fell on the village of Lockerbie. And he went out, the first thing he said, I'm going to bring all the bodies in by Christmas. He didn't, he failed. Couldn't happen. Weren't enough people, even though we got hundreds of people from other police forces and from the military. He said, we're going to get all the aircraft and its parts, and we'll get those collected in a couple of weeks. The police collected evidence in Scotland for over 2 years before they eventually said, we don't think we're going to find anything else. At the very end, where those two trails come together, is the village of Lockerbie, where the main part of the airplane fell, but the wind blew debris and evidence to the east side. Literally, it was scattered from coast to coast in Scotland. This is an area called Sherwood Crescent on the western edge of Lockerbie. It's where the aircraft with 3 of its engines and the wing box actually crashed into the village. This was a cul-de-sac. This is where all 11 people on the ground who died were killed. If that airplane had gone about another 200 yards, it would have crashed into an open field on the other side of the interstate west of Lockerbie, and no one on the ground probably would have died. But unfortunately, the airplane crashed there. And you can look at that hole, the crater that was caused. It's about 30 meters long. It's about 10 meters deep and 10 meters across. It's a big hole. And you can look in there and say there's not much of that airplane that's left. Another photograph of that crater. There were about 28 houses that were either partially or totally destroyed when the aircraft crashed into the ground, when 200,000 pounds of aviation fuel started to burn. This became the signature of the crash, the Maid of the Seas, the cockpit of the airplane, which crashed in a field of Tundergarth. There were about 11 or 12 first-class passengers, as well as the 3 members of the flight crew, still in that piece of cargo, that piece of aircraft when the police got there. Again, this photograph, very famous picture taken of the PanAm 103 airplane. Imagine this wheel well assembly from a 747 crashes on your deck outside your house while you're having dinner. Fortunately, no one was killed here. This is the engine that came off. It literally is 5 meters into the ground, right in the center of Lockerbie. This is an area called Rosebank, where the police had to collect evidence, and it's a 1-block square area surrounded by apartments. And inside this, they found 61 bodies, but you can see all the garbage, the things that came out of that aircraft as the airplane was coming to ground. As the airplane continued to fly from 31,000 feet, as it's falling, the engines are still running. And the aircraft is dumping out its cargo and its passengers. And Lockerbie sits on the side of a hill. And as the aircraft comes down, it loses altitude, and about 200 yards later is where it actually crashes into the area of Sherwood Crescent. Despite all that, I don't know what this says about French champagne. That bottle fell 31,000 feet. You can see how soft the soil is. Very soft soil when they went to collect the evidence. Well, clearly, we didn't know what we had. We're sitting in Washington and we said, was this an act of terrorism? Was it an accident? Something that had to be determined. If it was terrorism, we certainly had a lot of suspects. I'll actually start at the bottom, even though I'm going to talk about them in more detail. But the media immediately focused on that Palestinian cell in Germany because of the arrest in Frankfurt just 2 months before in the possession of bombs. And this aircraft had left from, this flight had left from Frankfurt. But we had a lot of suspects if, in fact, it was terrorism. Libya was a suspect. We had to think about them because of the U.S. attack on Tripoli in 1986. And then shortly after January 1st, when the media is focusing on the Palestinian group, an unknown man walks into the U.S. Embassy in Vienna, Austria, and leaves a letter for the ambassador which says, I see the media is focused on the PFL-PGC. I don't think they did it. And he describes a meeting that he went to in Tripoli in the middle of December 1988. And he describes it in great detail and describes who was there and gives us a lot of information. The only thing he doesn't give us is a name. And this letter goes into a file, but remember that, because the investigation hadn't even gotten started yet. We certainly thought Iran was a suspect because of the Iranians swearing that they're going to attack the United States because of the U.S. raid on Tripoli. You had the thought of the unwitting courier, someone carrying a bomb on the plane for someone else. You remember the question? Has anybody given you something to carry on the plane? There were several examples of aircraft that had either been blown up or had been stopped from being blown up with people, mostly women, carrying gifts from other people, taking them on the airplane. Khalid Jafar, one of two Middle Eastern names. You know, we have Rush to Judgment. Everybody focused on him, including the media, particularly the media, because he had a Middle Eastern name. He became a suspect. At least in the media's mind, we looked at him in great detail. There were two American girls who had gone to a party the night before and met several Middle Eastern men. People focused on that, spent a lot of time looking at them because that's where a lot of these threats had come from. Certainly Abu Nidal. Abu Nidal liked airports and aviation. He'd been responsible for the attacks at the Rome and Vienna airport just a couple of years before. He attacked PanAm 73 in Karachi the year before. He liked aircrafts and aviation. This was the attack at the Vienna airport in December 1985. But we had to really think hard about the PFL-PGC, led by Ahmed Jibril, the man that made the threat in 1986, which said there'd be no safety for anybody traveling on an American or an Israeli airliner until the Middle East situation is resolved. And the reason we thought about them was because of this radio. Somebody had a sense of humor. The name of that radio is a Toshiba Bomb Beat. This was a radio that was recovered by the BKA in Germany in October that had in it a barometric timer designed to be used against aviation. And this timer was actually, the thing would work. It was very, very accurate. And it also gave us some cause because it would literally go off about 30 minutes after the plane blew up, which led us to think, well, maybe it left from London. And the BKA was very quick to say, this bomb did not leave from Frankfurt because we wrapped all those people up. It didn't happen here, if in fact it was a bomb. Nothing to do with us. And there was a lot of discussion about that in the early days. The police constable, the chief constable, sent everybody out into the field and said, collect everything. Unless it's growing there, pick up everything. When we got to trial in 1999, 2000, 2001, we discovered what a problem it was for things that were not expertly documented. Significant problems because of people scratching things out and writing, let's change what this is. Is this evidence or is it debris? What is it? What do we call it when we put it into the evidence system? This became problems, but they did collect everything. They picked everything up in those 845 square miles. The day before Christmas, this piece of evidence was found, and what this was a piece of the framing for a cargo container. This piece of framing, if you can see, you saw that French champagne bottle, how it fell to earth, nothing happened. This piece of cargo, this piece of aluminum was the framing for a cargo bin. And you can see it's torn and ripped, and those black marks are actually the unconsumed particles of RDX and PETN. And I know nothing about explosives. I know, I'm not an expert in it, but I'm told that those are the things that make up Semtex, a Czech-made plastic explosive. We knew on December 24th we had a bombing. Don't have time to go into all the detail about what it took to get us to work with the Scottish police, but they agreed to allow us to assist them. We did not collect evidence. We did not examine evidence. But we would do the investigation together, although it took us almost 2 years before we actually did it really together. It took a long time because we did a lot of everybody not sharing, just running off and doing their own thing. This is the actual cargo container. If you can see the one behind it that's got the PanAm logo, that's made out of fiberglass, and that survived other than being broken, that 31,000-foot fall. But this piece of cargo container, as you can see, was totally ripped apart. And the framing, they put that back together. They also knew exactly where it stood, where it sat in the aircraft based on its number. And it sat right where the seat of the explosion was. And forensics people would tell us that the suitcase was about the second layer of bags right next to the edge of the aircraft, where it was stacked when they did tests to try to find out what it would take to blow up a 747 and to bring it down. But we also knew that the bags that were in that container, some of them had come from other passengers who had flown into London and were connecting to this flight, but the vast majority had come from the Frankfurt flight. So we immediately started to think about the PFLP-GC. This is a photograph of the reconstruction of the airplane, and you can see in the bottom of the photograph where the airplane actually, the major structural damage took place to the aircraft. Close-up of the same picture. That's a finger. And anybody want to think that that's not a small piece of evidence? Excuse me. When they're fooling with that cargo container, they were shaking it and this fell out. Somebody picked it up and said, "What is it?" Took them a while, but they said, "It's a piece of a circuit board. What does it match?" And we got a little bit lucky because it had numbers on it. And they matched it to a circuit board. Circuit board of a Toshiba RTSF-16 radio. It's a Toshiba, but it's not the same as the one used by the Palestinians. A little bit different, but we also learned that bomb builders like to use some of the same components. If this worked, something else will work in the future. So we immediately started to think it's the PFLP-GC. And we started to focus on this cell in Germany. And the Germans did not want to admit that, yes, in fact, this had been that cell. These people are all in jail. So when we started to focus on, we asked them, where are these 16 people? Well, we still have 2 of them in custody. Where's the bomb builder? Well, he went back to Jordan because he was actually a double agent. He was working for the Palestinians and he was working for Jordanian intelligence, and we had to let him go. Well, where are all these other people? Well, there's still 2 of them in jail, and they've been charged with bombing U.S. troop trains in 1987. They're still sitting in jail, but they weren't talking to anybody. And the Germans said, besides, we wrapped up this cell, but something happened. We convinced them to go back and research one of the apartments that they had searched the year before based on information we had gotten from the Jordanians. They went back and they found several other electronic components, which they took back to BKA headquarters, took them into the lab. Lab technicians started to fool with them, and one of them exploded and he was killed. And the Germans got very upset. They did something unprecedented. They allowed the Scots and the FBI to come and assist them in a series of searches and interviews in April of 1989. And they allowed us to go do it. We looked through the apartments, we looked for evidence, and we found absolutely nothing that would connect them to the PanAm 103 bombing. And it was very frustrating because the media, this was a big deal. This was the 9/11 of its day. This was a big story that was in the media for a long period of time. And it's going to be a long time before we stop looking at the PFLP-GC. But in the meantime, Scottish police officers are scouring the countryside, and they're picking up things. And it's being very slowly examined. And it's being taken down to England to be looked at a place called Rardy. And they're looking at the evidence. And they're starting to bring items back to them, small bits of clothing that had been shredded and torn and burned. And the forensic examiners could tell us with certainty which pieces of evidence were in the bomb bag, were right next to the seat of the explosion. And these small items of clothing were being recovered, being examined, and we were starting to put the pieces together. Again, forensics. And they told us that by looking at some of these things, there was one thing that was constant. The strongest part of any piece of garment was the collar. And the one thing that seemed like it survived a lot was the label. I guess if you bought a clothing's worth of labels, if you travel a lot, it'd probably survive better than the clothes that we all wear. But in addition to the clothing they were finding bits and pieces of a suitcase. Eventually they would find 54 pieces of a suitcase, as well as the lining, which helped us get our lead, which led us to the Samsonite company in Denver. And this Samsonite Silhouette 4000, antique copper, bronze colored in color, that contained the bomb. So 6 months have gone by. We know it was a bombing. We figured it was probably terrorism, although we looked at everybody to find out, did somebody want Aunt Tilly dead? Somebody want to kill their husband or their brother? We couldn't find any of those things. We believed it was probably terrorism, but there were no claims by anybody that we would look at as a responsible group. There were several claims the first couple of days, but nothing that could be substantiated. We're looking at everybody and we're looking at everything and not sharing information very well. When we started to look at the island of Malta in the summer of 1989. Now, the bombing was in December. 9 months later, Scottish police officer goes to Malta to follow up on those pieces of clothing because a couple of the tags that had been discovered at Lockerbie had the notation in the label, made in Malta. We didn't know exactly what this meant. So we go there because of this item of clothing, and you can see it's very small, but the forensic examiners tell us it's got the hallmarks of being burned, probably was in the seat of the explosion because many other suitcases came to earth totally intact. Some of the other suitcases that were near the bombing, the clothing was torn, it was burned, but not like this. They said this was probably right in the suitcase. The front side, you see the word Yorkie. On the back side of it, you see the number 1705, which indicates the lot number for that piece of evidence. So the Scottish officer goes to Malta. What we don't know about, because the forensic examiner said, I'm doing it all myself, he had not yet opened it up. All we know is Yorkie clothing, that's a lead. All those items that you see on the bottom part of that photograph were not recovered for about another 4 months because he hadn't gotten into that piece of evidence yet. We knew we had the Yorkie clothing, and when you look at the very bottom left of the screen, you're going to see a very small silver piece. That small silver piece, we believe, was this piece of the speaker grill from that black Toshiba radio. The black plastic is pieces of the black plastic of that two speakers Toshiba radio. That piece of white at the bottom is actually, lest you think we're really brilliant, was actually the instruction manual for that radio written in Arabic. And that small fragment that you see with the circle around it, that piece of evidence solved this case. That piece of evidence was smaller than that piece that you saw on that finger. Smaller than that. When I first saw that in the laboratory in London, the guy let me look at it under the lab director let me look at it under a microscope, and we walked away from it, and I said, please put that away, because if somebody sneezes, we'd have to do a crime scene search in your lab to find it again. It was that small. I was shocked at how small that piece of evidence was. But we're not going to find out about that for about 4 months. But I'll go back to that in a second. Scottish police officer goes to the Yorkie Clothing Company, and he gives us this receipt. And he said, on November the 18th, I sold a number of pieces of items, including lot number 1705, to Tony Gauci. Tony Gauci was a local businessman in Malta, which is a small island in the Mediterranean, south of Sicily, north of Tripoli, north of Libya. This is Tony Gauci's shop, Mary's house. Must have been taken at the time of the afternoon siesta. But Tony Gauci was the person that sold this. And Harry Bell, the police officer from Glasgow, goes and interviews him. He says, yes, that's my signature on that receipt. I bought all those clothes. And they show him lots of pictures. He doesn't have a lot of recollections about who he sold that to, but they showed him pictures of a lot of the clothing that had been found at Lockerbie with extensive blast damage. And the thing that jumped out at him was a fragment of fake Harris tweed. He said, I recognize that because I had that jacket in my shop for 5 years. I couldn't sell it. Malta's a temperate climate. Nobody wears wool here. And he said, I recognize that. He said, some guy came in here about a year ago, and he says he walked in, I don't remember the exact date, he came in, he tried it on, it fit, I gave him a good deal, and he bought it. But then he started to think, and he said, but he also bought a lot of other things. He bought baby clothes, and they had found a pair of baby's pajamas with a lamb's head on it. Extensive blast damage. All the things he was telling them were starting to match up. But he said, did you find an umbrella? And they hadn't examined all the umbrellas. So they immediately go back to Lockerbie and discover an umbrella sitting on the shelf with dozens of others which had extensive blast damage that the forensic examiner said were contained in the bomb suitcase. He said the man had a Libyan accent, and based on other things he told us, in September 1989, we established the date of the purchase as probably December 7th, 1988. That's when we said. He gives us a drawing. We sent an FBI artist to Malta to do the drawing. That picture on the left is the drawing done by the FBI artist. Because the BKA had a different system, they used a video. They did something called a video fit. It's supposed to be the same person. And we sent this out to a lot of intelligence agencies. Tell us who this person is, and we never got anything back. I know you can't read that. But in September, the same time we're finding out for the first time about this Scottish detective's trip to Malta, and the Scottish police are saying nobody should run off on their own, we should do it in coordination, but we're finding out about it for the first time. We get this document from the BKA. What it was a piece of evidence from Frankfurt Airport. There was a lady by the name of Bogomira Iraq who had worked at the airport. She comes to work the next morning after the bombing, and she said, you know, Frankfurt Airport has its own baggage retrieval system, its own computer system, and it wipes itself out after 72 hours. I'm going to print it off because it might be important. Nobody had ever asked for it. We didn't know it existed. The airlines had their own systems. We did not know that Frankfurt Airport had one. She prints it off, puts it in the bottom drawer of her desk, and forgets about it. Months later, she gives it to her boss. Her boss gives it to the BKA, and 9 months into the investigation, we get this printout. And after pouring through it, that one piece that's got the highlight through it, that is a computer printout which indicates that on December 21st, 1988, one bag had come from an Air Malta flight, KM 180, from Malta to Frankfurt, and it was transferred to PanAm 103. And we had no indications of anyone coming from Malta that day or any luggage coming from Malta that day to go to PanAm 103. All of a sudden, we have a bag. We have evidence that connects Malta to a bag on PanAm 103. Was it the bomb bag? We don't know that, but we now have physical evidence which ties shop being sold there. Now we have an airline notation. That small fragment I showed you a minute ago, not the one on the finger, but the one with the red circle around it. If you look at the very top of that, I'm not a forensics person. I got D's in biology, chemistry, and physics. So I didn't do very well. That was high school and college. I had to take one physical science course. I got a D. I got through it. I'm not a forensics guy. That's why I did investigation. At any rate, I'm talking about interviewing people in investigation. You do the real work. You find these things. If you look at the top fragment, that's the fragment that the Scots decided to tell us about because the forensic examiners had identified it for them. They tell us about it in January 1990, a year into the investigation. Police officer tells us about this, the Scottish senior investigating officer tells us about this piece of evidence, and he said, we don't know what this means, but it looks like a piece of circuit board. We don't know what it goes to. It doesn't have numbers. It doesn't look like anything that we have at Lockerbie or have seen before. We said, well, give us a photograph and we'll see if we can find out what it is. And they went, nope, we want to do it ourselves. We hadn't yet learned to work together. We're going to do it. So they spent 6 months. They ran all over the world. 17 countries, 55 companies. They show up at Quantico 6 months later. We had a meeting and they said, we give up. We have no clue. Take a photograph and see if you can figure it out. Took our forensics guy, Tom Thurman, 2 days to find out what it was. He knew where to go. He went to the CIA. And he goes out and he said, do you guys have something that looks like this? And they looked on their shelves and they, not only they have photographs of something that looked like that, they actually had a timer that had been seized, and more on that later. If you look at the comparison, if you look at the cut, how that's cut right behind what looks like a 1, that was designed to go into a waterproof, sandproof box. When we eventually found the person that made it, he actually said, this was mine. About 2 inches square was the actual timer. This is the one where the photograph was taken of this in Senegal. We find out that the first one that we actually have in the possession of the U.S. government was a timer that was made in, was discovered in Togo. We don't know where it was made yet. Discovered in Togo in 1986. Nobody knows where it came from. The second one was recovered in Dakar, Senegal, at the airport. 2 Libyan intelligence officers in February 1988, 10 months before the bombing, went through the airport. They were arrested with explosives, and they had this timer on them. We had photographs of that, but it solved one of our problems. We were always thinking it was a barometric timer that should have gone off 30 minutes after it left. Now what we believe we have is a straight timer. Set the time. It doesn't matter how many times the plane goes up and down. It's a straight timer. Let's figure out who did this. When he takes it apart, when Tom takes it apart, he finds letters on the back of it, M-E-B-O. And he finds these letters. We don't know what MEBO is, but eventually we would find them. It's a firm in Zurich, Meister et Bollier, first 2 letters of each of their last names. They have a magistrate's hearing in Switzerland. Very frustrating because as an investigator, I want to talk to you. I want you to tell me what you know. We had to go through a magistrate, through judges. And that we give them questions and the judges ask the questions. But they tell us generally the same thing, the 2 principals and the person that actually built the timer. They said that the Libyans had asked them in 1985 for prototypes that they could have a big order for. They said, make us 20, we'll test them. If they work, we'll buy more. First 5 were delivered by Mr. Bollier to Libyan People's Bureau in Berlin. The last 15 taken to Tripoli, delivered to Libyan officials in Tripoli in 1985 and 1986. And they tested some of them. And they looked at that PT35 as the fragment number for that small fragment, which looks like a 1 that had the circle around it. They positively identified it, but they also tell us that in December 1988, we got this rush telephone call from Tripoli saying, can you get us 40 more of those timers? He said, we didn't have them, we didn't deliver them, we couldn't come up with them quite that fast. In the meantime, we had gotten everybody together, intelligence and law enforcement agencies, and we said, hey guys, this isn't working. People smarter than me said, let's sit down and figure this out. We sat at a table in Washington and we all said, we need to share. Intelligence, law enforcement, we can help each other. We never got the forensics people to quite agree, because even though we wanted to send people from our lab, that one guy wanted to all do it by himself. But we at least got the intelligence and law enforcement agencies to collaborate, to share information on a real-time basis. They were starting to give us names of intelligence officers. We knew a lot. We had gone to Malta and we had computerized all of the immigration records, which were in shoe boxes. And we come up with names. One of them is a man by the name of Megrahi. We knew that he had been in Malta the day the clothing was purchased, but he had not been in Malta the 20th or 21st of December. We didn't have a photograph of him, so we couldn't show it to the shopkeeper. But we discovered during the magistrate's hearing that he had done business with Bollier. He had set up a front company in the Mibo premises in Zurich. We found some connections between the two of them, so he becomes a suspect. This is Lucca Airport in Malta, in Valletta, where we're going to allege that the bomb would leave on December the 21st. That process of computerizing those records was time-consuming and costly, but it's going to pay dividends, because one morning, another intelligence agency, now we're sharing, they call us and they said, we don't know who this guy is, but this man by the name of Ahmed Khalifa Abdus Samad, we think has connections to Megrahi. Who is he? And we'd never heard the name before. We discovered he was not in Malta the day the clothing was purchased, but he was in Malta the 20th and 21st of December. So we start to look at him. We bring Mr. Bollier, the principal of MIBO, to the United States, and he tells us a few things. He tells us a few more things about that trip to Libya in 1988 in December when they called him. He said, well, I actually went. I went to the local Walmart and I bought 40 Olympus timers, took them back to the shop, stamped MIBO's stickers on them, and jacked up the price 400%. And I took them to Tripoli and tried to pass them off, and they said, this is not what we need. These are junk. Besides, we already have what we need. And they sent him packing. He goes back and he said, I cannot believe that you found a fragment of my timer at the crime scene in Lockerbie. I thought the reason that you contacted me was because of the letter I dropped off to the U.S. Embassy in Vienna in 1989. You've heard that before, right? All of a sudden, we didn't have a clue because we didn't know who he was. We had nothing to follow up with him. All of a sudden, we've got a clue connecting him. He tried to get us on the right track in 1989. He looks at this drawing of the person that bought the clothing and he said, hey, you know, that guy looks like Megrahi. Well, at the same time, we're now getting international cooperation. We got another intelligence service to give us this photograph from his passport. And we took that photograph to Mr. Gauci, and he looks at the pictures and he says, the shopkeeper, of all the pictures you show me, if this guy was a little bit older, this is the guy that bought the clothes. We thought perhaps we had a pretty good thing going, but we also know we could not connect Megrahi to the 20th and 21st of December. But two things are going to be important when we get to our indictment. Mr. Megrahi, if you look at the very bottom of that first segment of that, we're going to allege that he is Ahmed Khalifa Abdus Samad, which we're going to prove in a minute. And he's also, look what his job is in the very bottom. He's the chief of aviation security for Libyan Arab Airlines. He's like their head of TSA. Pretty bad when you think he's involved in the process. Remember Mr. Ahmed Khalifa Abdus Samad? We've got information he's in Malta the 20th and 21st of December. Looking at his immigration records, he stayed at the Holiday Inn. And they get the records of the Holiday Inn, and the Holiday Inn records show a couple things that are important. Shows up top, Libyan Arab Airlines, he got the employee discount. Even though he says he works for the AH company, Megrahi's front company in Tripoli, in Zurich, was the ABH company. But he's in room 518. But the most significant thing he leaves is his passport number. Libyan passport number 233351. That is actually written in this document, but he also makes a phone call the next morning, December 21st, 7:11 a.m. He calls this man, Lamine Khalifa Fima. And if you can see what his job is at the very bottom, he's a station manager for Libyan Arab Airlines in Malta. So we start to look into Mr. FEMA, but we discovered something that was kind of bad. He had left his employment in October 1988. He wasn't working at the airport anymore. So we go to a man that he'd gone into business with, a local Maltese man, who said, I've got my diary from 1988. I'll bring it to the office tomorrow. And he looks in there and he has a notation for December the 20th. Mr. FEMA came to my house. He and Mr. Megrahi came from Tripoli. It was Mr. Megrahi's first visit to my house. We've got no evidence Mr. Megrahi's there. We know Abdul Samad is, but we have no evidence Mr. Megrahi's there. So we're starting to think maybe Mr. Megrahi and Mr. Abdul Samad are the same person. So he says, in addition to that, Mr. FEMA's office is right next door. It's abandoned. Would you like to look through it? Anybody want to guess what our answer was? Oh, thank you very much. And we go in, we look through it, and we find two things that are significant. One of them is his airside access badge, his security badge for Lucca Airport. This is in 1991, still sitting in his desk, good until December 31st, 1988. He had access to that airport in December 1988. But the second thing he gives us, we find he leaves behind, is his diary for 1988. I was at Quantico on Tuesday and had a police officer from Iraq. I always like to have somebody else can read Arabic, read this to me. That last bullet written in black says, Mr. Abdul Basit is coming from Zurich. Obviously it hadn't happened yet because it was that day. But he's got okay written on two things. One of them has to do with his car. The second one's down at the very bottom. One word written in English, it says, get tags from the Air Malta airline to give to Abdul Basit Abdul Salam. Get luggage tags. And you're going to see how he tried to explain that. At the same time, we get a man named Majid who defects, former Libyan intelligence officer, not high level, but he'd actually worked at Lucca Airport. He'd worked for Megrahi and FEMA. He comes there and we interview him for 2 weeks. And he tells us some things that are very significant. He says, Mr. Megrahi is a member of the JSO, the Jamahiriya Security Organization. He's a Libyan agent. He said that Semtex was kept in Mr. FEMA's desk at the Air Malta, at the Libyan Arab Airlines office. I don't know why an aviation official needs plastic explosive in his desk. He said that Saeed Rashid, who we find out later is a high Libyan official, is the president of the Electric General Company, had bought most of those black radios because about 200,000 were made. The vast majority were bought by Libyans, vast majority by him. He had inquired with Majid in 1986 after the U.S. raid, is it possible to get a bag on a British or an American airliner leaving Malta? This is what he's suggesting. And then he also tells us he sees FEMA and Megrahi at the Lucca Airport in October, November, December 1988 with a large brown suitcase. When we showed him photo spreads, he picks out the Samsonite Silhouette 4000. He said they didn't have the exact date, but they went and got into FEMA's car, which had been purchased on December the 14th, 1988. So we made an assumption it was probably taken, he probably saw this December 20th in the evening. The indictment comes out, it's very simple, and it says Megrahi buys the clothes on the 7th. On the night of the 20th, Megrahi and FEMA fly into Malta, Megrahi using the Abdul Samad alias. They fly into Malta, they go visit the Maltese man, they split up. One goes to the apartment, the other one goes to the hotel. The next morning, the call is made, they come together, and at 9:52, the bomb bag with the stolen tag makes its way to Frankfurt and then on to the United States, to London, and then on to toward the United States. If you looked at the aviation guide for 1988, the routing that you would take to come to America from Valletta would be KM 180, PanAm 103 from Frankfurt. That's the way you'd be routed by any travel agent. The bomb arrives and by the way, 30 minutes later, Mr. Megrahi leaves to go back to Tripoli. Bag goes to Frankfurt, it arrives at 12:41. That computer printout is made shortly after 1 o'clock when the bag is coming through their aviation system. It goes to the plane, leaves at 4:19, arrives London at 5:40, flight leaves at 6 o'clock, actually gets off the ground at 6:25, and the plane explodes at 6:25. We have joint indictments, but in November 1991, right after the indictments, you're going to see what both Mr. FEMA and Mr. Megrahi had to say to acquit themselves.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We begin tonight with the bombing of PanAm Flight 103. 2 weeks after charging that the government of Libya was behind the bombing 3 years ago over Lockerbie, Scotland, the U.S. and Britain today have demanded that Libya accept responsibility and hand over for trial the 2 men who were specifically indicted. In Libya, Colonel Gaddafi insists that his government has been unfairly accused. And ABC's Pierre Salinger is the only reporter to interview the two men who are charged with killing 270 people.
Abdul Basit al-Megrahi is accused of being the mastermind of the PanAm 103 bombing, but he vigorously denies it.
You accuse me falsely.
The American indictment said Megrahi was the chief of security for Libyan Arab Airlines. Megrahi said he was just a dispatcher and that he was not on the island of Malta on the crucial day of December 21st, 1988, as the indictment charged. That was the day when a suitcase containing a bomb was allegedly put on an Air Malta flight to Frankfurt and then transferred to PanAm 103.
In 20 of December or 21, or at that time, I wasn't there, believe me. I was here in Tripoli with my family.
He showed us a passport with a stamp indicating he was in Malta on another important date, December 7th, when the indictment says he went to this store and bought clothes and an umbrella that were later found in the wreckage of PanAm 103.
Believe me, I didn't go to any shop there, and even what they said, umbrella. No, even umbrella. What are you doing with umbrella?
Megrahi said he had been in Malta many times on business, and so many people knew him that it would have been impossible for him to use a false passport, as the U.S. indictment alleges. He denies any involvement in Libyan intelligence, particularly any role in ordering timing devices to be used with explosives.
If you give me a timer now, I can't recognize if it is timer or something like this, you see, unless you tell me this is a timer.
U.S. authorities are relying on the diary belonging to the second Libyan suspect, Al-Amin Khalifa Fima. It is alleged that Fima wrote a reminder to himself to obtain Air Malta baggage tags. Tags, the indictment says, were stolen and used to label the suitcase that exploded.
I worked for the airlines. Those tags are readily available on the counter. Anybody can pick them up.
Fima, who also worked for the Libyan airline, also denies any role in the bombing. U.S. and British authorities claim they have a lot of evidence, including eyewitness identification, that implicates the two men.
Early 1992, the UN put sanctions on Libya. You heard what Mr. Megrahi said. I'm not an intelligence officer. I was not in Malta. I don't know who Abdul Samad is. I don't know what Mibo is. I don't know any of those things. I know nothing. But finally, Gaddafi agrees he's going to turn them over because the sanctions were hurting. He decides to have the trial. They're turned over to the Dutch, the UN, eventually the Scots, and they had a Scottish court sitting in the Netherlands at Camp Van Zeist, an old U.S. military base. And here's where Catherine Terman makes a significant contribution. She was then the director of the Office for Victims of Crime in Washington for the Justice Department, and she made a decision that she was going to help the victims because we had not done a very good job of working with them. Working with victims, trying to keep them on our side. She arranged for the victims' families, no matter their nationality, not just Americans, 189 Americans on that plane. Anybody that's there could send two family members for a week, full expenses of the Crime Victims Fund to go to the trial. She also arranged for closed-circuit television to New York, to Washington, to Lockerbie, and to London, so that families could actually go sit and watch it if they couldn't make it and end up in Camp Van Zeist. They're surrendered in 1999. They put together this elaborate courtroom with the screen that's going to come down and block witnesses because we're going to have defectors, we're going to have CIA agents. First time in history, MI5 agents are going to testify. It's okay to let the bad guys see them, but let's not let everybody else. The Scots sent down judges, 3 of them. This trial is supposed to last 3 years. And you see the reason that they actually sent 4 judges, because the average age of these guys is about 104. And somebody decided we better send a 4th judge. He was only 97. We'll send the 4th judge to sit there in case one of them croaks during this 3-year trial. So the trial is going to start in 2000. This is who's going to hear the judgment. The trial starts in 2000, but there's a couple things that you haven't heard yet. Recognize that photograph? Mr. Megrahi. When the Scots went to Tripoli, the U.S. government didn't go. We had no diplomatic relations with the Libyans. The Scots go to Tripoli, they go to the passport office, and they said, we want to see the records for Mr. Abdul Samad. Megrahi's and Fima's were normal. They find only one document in the Abdul Samad file, and it says, remember what Megrahi said, I don't know Abdul Samad, I'm not an intelligence officer. they find one document in the file. It's a letter from the Libyan intelligence service to the passport office, which says, we'd like to have a coded passport for our intelligence officer Megrahi, and we'd like you to make it in the name of Abdul Samad. Not only that, this passport shows up with him when he comes to trial. He brings the one you saw that Pierre Salinger showed you, but he also brings this one, 332351. The same passport number that he signed in as Abdul Samad at the Holiday Inn on the 20th of December. He shows up there, not that it's a crime to lie to a reporter, but I think this helped nail his coffin, helped get him convicted. When they hear all the evidence trial started in May of 2000, and in the 31st of January 2001, they announced their verdict, and I was there. It was very electric. I was there with a lot of the families to see the reaction that they had, because this was really going to tell, what do these judges think about our evidence? They found Mr. Megrahi guilty. They found Mr. Fima innocent and sent him home. Megrahi was sentenced to first 20 and then 27 years in prison. His appeal was upheld, and a year after the trial, he was actually taken to Glasgow to spend the rest of his life, which will be the rest of his natural-born life, in prison. There is a second appeal that was granted to him a couple of years ago. He currently has prostate cancer and allegedly only has months to live. There's a lot of people that think he should be freed on compassionate grounds. Needless to say, I don't take that same view. That's another story. How did we keep, and I'll tell you, Gaddafi has admitted he did this. He paid the families $10 million apiece. $2.7 billion was paid to the families. He's renounced terrorism, but amazingly enough, he gave up his weapons of mass destruction 7 days exactly after the U.S. found Saddam Hussein in a hole. Anybody want to connect the dots there? I think we can all do that. We had some things to keep the investigators motivated. There were about 16 children on that plane under the age of 6. We all had kids. We had an awful lot of frustrating days when we would show up and we had nothing to report. People were banging our doors down. What's going on? Who did this? They wanted an answer on December 23rd, or 24th, when we knew it was a bombing. Who did this? So we kept his baby shoe up. That motivated us. The second thing was the Scottish police and the FBI disagreed about a lot of things. But there's one thing we always agreed on. That attack was the United States of America. The attack on that airplane was an attack on the United States. So this picture of the nose cone of PanAm 103 with the American flag on it was kept up because we thought we're doing this not only for the kids, we're doing it for our country. It was something that kept us motivated every single day as we'd get to work. This is the cemetery at Lockerbie at Drifesdale. There are about 4 memorial sites in Lockerbie. This is the one where they buried all the people who could not be identified. There was no DNA, at least not widespread, in 1988 and 89. A lot of the bodies, I think the exact number is somewhere around 35, never identified, buried in a mass grave there. Very, very old cemetery, and it's a place that you can't talk very loud when you walk there because it's such a moving place. The Scots decided that American families, because there were 189 of them, needed a place to come in the United States, so they donated 270 stones to represent all of the families, and they had these erected at Arlington Cemetery about 10 years ago. And it's a place that they meet every December 21st. We learned a lot of lessons. We learned about sharing information. I learned about the power of forensics, paying attention to detail. You know, I remember when I went through the FBI Academy in 1971, I got the fingerprints, I did tire casts, I did all that stuff that I never used. I did fingerprints one time on a stolen car. I just figured, we're never going to identify who stole this car, but we impressed everybody in the neighborhood by dusting and taking the prints off. That's about the only time I ever did any forensic work. And I saw how valuable and how important it was what you do, what forensic scientists do. You can solve major cases. Pay attention to all the detail. Document clearly and completely what you do. You have to be tenacious. Doing an investigation that's going to last 3 or it took almost about 12 years to get to trial, that's a long time. You've got to have tenacity. You got to motivate people. Sometimes you get a major case, you have to deal with motivating people. And last one certainly is dealing with victims. They can hurt you and they can help you. I don't think we need to share every bit of information with them, but there's probably a lot more information that we could have shared with them because I saw the big difference between what the FBI did and what the Scottish police did. People have said we were enveloped with love when we went to Lockerbie. The Scots wouldn't tell them anything about the investigation, but they did everything else. When the evidence went back to them, it wasn't sent by FedEx. They would wash and iron all the clothing that was not evidentiary, put it in a suitcase, and a Scottish police officer hand-carried it to their door. That meant something to these people. They will always have a soft spot in their heart for the Scottish police, something they don't necessarily have for the CIA, the State Department. The FBI is not too bad. They thought we were probably okay, but they still didn't think that most entities of our government really supported them when it came time to do this case. I'm a little bit of a whore. I'm not selling my book, but I thought I'd put that up there anyway. This only took an hour. My book took me a year to write, took me a year to get the FBI to approve it, and a year to find a publisher. And it's probably sold 12 copies, but that's another story. But if you're looking for it, it's on Amazon.com. If you ever need to contact me for any reason, I know I've really cut it short, and what I think I will do for questions is, I know you've got something in this room next. I can go out in the hallway. I'd be happy to answer questions. Thank you for what you do. It's very important. I know you come from all over the globe. I appreciate what you do because it's very important, because we can't let particularly terrorists win. We have to make sure we find out who did these things and they are punished for their crimes. But feel free to call me, send me an email if you have a question. I'd be happy to answer it. Thank you for your time and attention, and I hope you all have a safe trip home.